Okay, good deal. So probably familiar with how it works, and it's awesome. Well, I'm excited to have you on. So you're obviously running for office. That's why you're here.
Yes.
Want to give you an introduction and a background for anybody who stumbles onto this?
Hi, Karthik. Thanks for having me on. I'm Angel Oakley, and I'm running for Congress in the 3rd Congressional District of Illinois. I'm running as an independent because I have never seen our country so divided, and I'm very concerned about where we're headed. I think that the division in our country is at such an all-time high that we're closer to civil war than I've ever seen us, and we really need to put down the labels and come back together as being Americans. So on the campaign trail, that was how I introduced myself to people, to really just get them to put down their guard and be willing to talk about the issues at hand. I care very much about our civil liberties and freedom of speech, which I think has been compromised, and also about peace. The fact that we're looking at war in multiple countries over this last administration is very concerning. And we need to get back to peaceful coexistence. And also the health of our children. The chronic disease epidemic that has run rampant and continues to increase amongst our children is very concerning. So I think that our federal government can make policies that can turn that around pretty quickly. And I would like to be part of that movement. There are a number of other things that I care immensely about, such as immigration and the fact that the border is nothing but chaos. And I live in an area in which we have a sanctuary city. And that's definitely been a big issue for constituents. And they are feeling the pressures of the fact that we have a lot of homeless in Chicago. We have people that are barely getting by, and they're watching all of our resources be gobbled up by people that are being shuttled in, and there are no checks and balances happening at the border. So we definitely need to get that under control. I'm all for immigration, but it has to be done in an orderly form. And then we look at this skyrocketing inflation that's happening. When we just gave away all this money during COVID, we had very irresponsible decisions being made. I think a lot of our elected officials need to go back to Economics 101. The idea that blaming all of the prices on price gouging is, again, irresponsible. We need sensible environmental policy. I'm a Rachel Carson environmentalist, and I believe in keeping the air, the water, and the soil clean, and that companies should be participating in any cleanups of any mess that they make. But we've definitely had corporate capture of the climate crisis narrative, and some of the things that are coming out of that. The money that's being appropriated for those initiatives is going to things that are actually more harmful than they are good. So I'd like to be part of those discussions as well, because we need sensible environmental policy, and a carbon pipeline that's putting explosive carbon that could kill people upon any kind of leak across this country is extremely concerning. And I don't like when the government takes eminent domain of properties to put something dangerous on those properties. So there are a lot of things to address these days. And I think that I have a unique background that allows me to contribute positively to those conversations.
Yeah, I love what you're bringing to the table, because I hear across the political spectrum from you. I hear ideas and things that you're concerned with individually that exist all across the political spectrum. So because you're not aligned with the Republican or the Democrat Party, you're free to actually express all of your concerns in a way that I think this country absolutely needs. Like, just because someone's a Republican doesn't mean they don't have to subscribe to the idea that we want clean air and clean water. Maybe you don't have to believe that man-made climate change is real. You don't have to, but at least you can want the same thing I do, which is clean water and clean air. At least we can agree on that and pursue forward. So then the economic principle of just printing money and then giving it for free. Like, I was one of the people in 2020 when I knew the stimulus check was about to come. I was vocal about not wanting it because I was employed at a what they deemed as an essential business. And I was like, this is a bad idea. I'm going to get $600, but I'm going to pay for it 5, 7, 10 times over. It's
Right.
back in 2020, and that's absolutely come to play. And it's sad. Like, we're suffering the effects of bad policies at the federal level, but nobody gets held accountable for it. We're the ones that have to take the blame and, well, not the blame, but we have to eat the consequences of it. So your candidacy as an independent candidate is interesting. Do you think that voters are right there with you and expressing the same concerns?
I do. And originally I wasn't sure. That's why I wanted to get out there and start talking to people. And in Illinois, the duopoly controls politics here. And I think they do pretty much across the country, but Illinois especially makes ballot access for anyone outside of the two major parties nearly impossible.
Mm-hmm.
And as an independent candidate, I was looking at needing to get 10 to 15,000 to secure a spot because you have to get 9126, 9,126 signatures to get on the ballot.
Mm-hmm.
So it was great to get out on the street and talk to people and get those signatures and hear from them. And people were resonating with the message, no question. But then I did have a lot of operatives interfering with us getting signatures and putting up roadblocks, and then, being told that I wasn't going to be allowed on the ballot, that they would definitely be challenging me. So ultimately, I did actually get challenged. We went through a lot of struggle with the Kennedy campaign as well, which I helped with. And ultimately, I was removed from the ballot last month. So I am a write-in candidate at this point.
Mm-hmm.
But I do feel like the residents were eager to have me on the ballot. I have a very gerrymandered district. So finding people that are in the district is difficult. I talked to I would say over 20,000 people. We had 28,000 cards, and we gave out nearly all of our cards. And many people were outside of the district that said, oh, if I was in your district, I would absolutely be voting for you. So we were resonating for sure. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. That's good. I have seen what has happened to candidates like yourself. I haven't actually watched your campaign, but I've spoken to people in Texas, right? And the duopoly, if they agree, the two parties, if they agree on one thing, it's to squash the competition. Right. And make sure that only the Republicans and the Democrats are the valid ones there. So you're just explaining another story. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. has a very similar story. He was booted out of the Democrat primary, basically by force. And then when he did that, the DNC committed lawfare against him to drain his funds and all that, and made ballot access very hard for him. And I watched all that. And then during that time, we had podcasts of libertarian candidates in Texas, and over half of those candidates that I interviewed at the beginning part of the year are no longer on the ballot because the GOP of Texas, Secretary of State, kicked them off the ballot. So it's like, I just get so radicalized when I see this stuff. I'm like, okay, so the Democrats want to talk about democracy, the Republicans want to talk about this is a republic, but you don't actually want competition? You don't actually want to be challenged on your bad ideas? That's what it seems like to me. They don't want to be they want to maintain whatever semblance of control that they have, so they squash independents and third parties alike to make sure that their control is just swaps between the two of them, which at the end of the day, we could call it a duopoly or a uniparty, and it's the same thing to me at the same time.
Yeah, absolutely. And the fact that they make everything partisan when it really doesn't need to be partisan, just to divide people and keep people distracted from the real issues, allows them to have the control because they can shape the narrative. And if we rose above that as a people and sat down at the table with people that had different views and we really hashed it out, we could make great progress. But that great progress wouldn't necessarily be the outcome that they're looking for. We've definitely got corporate capture, and corporatism has run rampant.
For sure. And I can attest to that because we have a small-sized business, mid-sized business here in Texas, in Houston. And some of the regulations that keeps getting put on are very obviously favoring the big giant businesses because they can afford to have big compliance departments, make sure that they're always staying on top of all these new laws and regulations. But it's going to be very prohibitive for the small mom and pop shop to actually compete. So I agree corporatism is a problem here. But what I want to kind of touch on is I'm actually inspired by you, even though you faced challenges by the establishment, you didn't give up. You're here on a podcast 2.5 weeks before the election. Even though they put you as a write-in candidate, you're still fighting. You're still trying to get the message out. And you spoke to 20 something thousand people. That's a lot. That's
It's
a
a
lot of
lot.
people who heard your message. That's not a small number. And I congratulate you and I respect for the work that you must have put in to get this far. So, yeah, maybe people who want to vote for you may not be in the district. Maybe people won't be able to because the ballot access was harder, but you've clearly made a dent in people's mind. Well, not a dent in people's minds, but you've left a lasting impression. So between here and the election, maybe even afterwards for the next cycle, what is going to be your strategy to kind of bring awareness and not necessarily awareness, but like, move the needle forward? How will you move the needle forward through this cycle and into the next?
Are you familiar with Braver Angels?
I'm not actually.
Okay. So Braver Angels and Undivide Us are both movements that are bringing people together of different political ideology and getting them to talk to one another.
Mm-hmm.
There's also citizens' assemblies. Are you familiar with citizens' assemblies?
I'm not.
Okay.
I feel ignorant now.
So that's also a great initiative. The Citizens Assembly that's bringing together, again, people of all different ideology and getting them to talk about particular topics that are of utmost importance and hashing through the various ideas associated with it to really try to come up with innovation that meets the needs of the greatest number of people. And if we can pull together those citizens and get them talking on that level, we can actually do what Congress has failed to do and what our state governments have often failed to do. And then we can have a robust number of people in the electorate that are able to call upon these elected officials to say, this is what we're championing. This is what we're championing. We want to see this happen and really put more pressure on them. So I'm looking at doing more of that over the next 2 years.
Interesting. I like to hear that because I have spoken with people who are very partisan voters, and they basically have very negative viewpoints of the opposite party, when I don't think that's necessarily fair. I think everybody just wants generally what's best for themselves and their family and their community. Maybe the disagreement is going to be on how we achieve that. Like, I'm a capitalist, and I know that people on a little bit further left of me are going to want more social programs, and I heavily disagree with that, but I'll attack the policy, not the person.
Right.
And so I think that's where we need to focus, is to attack the policy, debate those policies, and come forward together as a unified group and come up with something that can benefit the most amount of people. But instead, we have the Republicans calling the Democrats Democrats and the left calling the right maggots and Trumpers and all that. It's like, that's not what the issues are. The issues are, I want to be able to afford a house for my family and put them through school. That's the issue. How are we going to do that? We shouldn't be talking about each other like we're enemies. So getting those organizations to talk to people, have people talk to each other. What has been the impact? Have you seen that actually it dissolves the barriers?
So it doesn't necessarily change people's minds about the issue or where they sit on an issue. It does change their minds about how they view the other side.
Yeah.
And that's the most important part. I mean, I grew up in a family where my grandmother would vote one way and my grandfather vote the opposite. I think they cancel each other out, but we always had vigorous, robust debate. We discussed the issues and we still loved each other at the end of it. Mm-hmm. And we need to get back to that. Having been in the startup space and working as an entrepreneur for most of my career, I'm a big fan of, as iron sharpens iron, that's how we get the best innovation, right? We have to bring those people together and we have to hash out all of those ideas to come up with the best idea. And I agree with you on the meritocracy aspect. I think in America, that is the American dream, right? That you come in, you work hard. And if you work hard, you should be able to have a house and live well in this country. And I was in the city of Chicago where they've really pushed a lot of these ideologies that run kind of communist, socialist, over regulation, tax the company 70%, so on and so forth. And I had one guy that said, what did he say? I'm a communist anarchist. Okay. And I was a little taken by
Makes sense.
I was a little taken by his combination there. So I was like, well, what does that mean to you? So he started explaining it. And we had a fabulous conversation. I mean, it got a little, intense, but it was respectful. And, he expressed to me how they needed to be highly regulated. So then I said, well, if they're highly regulated, who's regulating them? Well, bureaucrats, right? Ultimately. And so what is the expertise of these bureaucrats? And really, if you're saying you don't want a hierarchy, what you're doing is you're actually putting a hierarchy in place, and you're putting inexperienced people in at the top of that hierarchy to make regulations in which small people like you and I can never start a business, because it's exactly what you were saying. It's the big companies that are going to be able to get through all of those hoops. If you've got 47 processes you've got to go through for one thing. Ultimately, it's the big companies. And on top of that, it makes all the products more expensive, which again harms us. So all of those things, they put a pretty bow on them, they package them up, and they make it sound good to people that really don't understand economics. But ultimately, it's actually hurting people. I always thought that the Democrat ideology was to help the basic person, right? To help the little person. And these things that they're talking about today are actually against their better interest. So I think when we point those things out, they do start to consider it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's important, because I've pointed this out too when I had talked to people. And I think it's very important to actually play this forward. It makes sense that I'm talking to somebody in the business space, because you're able to actually follow and even respond logically and linearly with these things, because to be able to understand the implications of 5 years down the line, even 10 moves after a regulation is placed, we have to be able to see how that actually plays out in the market. Just nuanced scenario here, right? I'm in Houston, Harris County. So we're a little bit smaller than you guys in Chicago, but, pretty large size. There are inconsistent regulations between the county and the state level, between permitting and whether that's federal or whatnot. But it was explained to me by my libertarian friend who is running for Libertarian House of Representatives in Texas against the Democrat, no Republican challenger. So it's a very interesting race. But basically, he told me that to replace the sidewalk in his own house, which he's liable for, he has to get a permit. And he has to go through a permitting thing and a permitting process. He has to get it approved by the HOA and all that stuff. But the regulation is inconsistent, because you don't need all that if you just replace less than 20 feet worth. So to get around that, you just do 20 feet at a time. So first of all, you have to be knowledgeable enough to understand that there is that process in place. But the fact that he draws attention to the idea that you don't have to go through all this expensive contractor and permitting process to just replace the sidewalk that you're already liable to replace. Especially, you're not changing it, you're just bringing it back to level. So this is a microcosm of what's happening on the grand scale.
Absolutely.
How much of that do we deal with?
Absolutely. We deal with that across the board. I mean, one of the things I've talked about extensively is we need legislators that actually can think through the potential unintended consequences of these policies, because so often they jump to create a policy, and in doing so, they cause more harm down the road than if they didn't have the policy, because they're not thinking through all these ways in which, like you said, someone's going to go around it. We're incentivizing people to do these other actions by these bad policies. And, when I looked at building regulations, so I was designing a LEED Platinum passive house, and I was really thinking through sustainability and energy, and how we can use buildings to enhance the overall environment. And when I started looking at the legislation, I realized that all the legislation is set up to encourage people to do the opposite. And so, like one example, stainless steel piping. Of course, that's going to be more expensive, right? But let's
Yeah.
say you really wanted to have the best piping, you're going to put in stainless steel. So if you look at the plumbing code for residential, it's not allowable.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't code for stainless steel. But if you look in the International Plumbing Code, it actually says when health and wellness is of the utmost importance, such as hospitals, prisons, you should use stainless steel. Okay, wait a minute here. So now we have a policy that says, so for prisons, we should be using stainless steel. But in my house, I have to go through a zillion different hoops in order to get stainless steel. They had the lobbyists come in for the fire sprinklers. Okay, great idea. We should have fire sprinklers. We want to save lives. I get it. But if you have a home that is not going to burn, let's say it's a concrete home, and there's nothing in the legislation now that allows there to be common sense. You can't say, oh, well, you don't have a burn hazard, so therefore you can not have the fire sprinklers. You still have to put them in. We had a guy whose child was having severe health impacts at school because there was mold present in the school. And so he was fighting the school, wanting them to do mitigation on the mold, and they weren't addressing it. So he had reached out to us. We were helping him with, advocating on that issue. Well, he ultimately started working with an organization that helped him draft a policy that would be adopted by our state legislators. But what it actually did was it turned over control of mold remediation to the health department. That really was not what needed to be done. What needed to be done was ultimately the school needed to just address his concern, right? We needed to say if there's a legitimate health concern that the school needs to address it. But instead, what we did was we just put the bureaucrats in charge of all mold remediation now. And he was told that that was the only thing that would pass the legislature. So again, unintended consequences. I tried to explain to him that now giving the state more power was not necessarily going to be in his best interest long term, and certainly wasn't addressing his issue. But we have that all the time. I see that constantly. And I think you look at the Farm Bill, that's a great example too of those types of things where you make it more difficult for farmers to actually do organic farming. Right?
Yeah.
So, lots of examples. And I think that that's one of the things we forget to ask when we're looking at people that are running for office. How good are you at problem solving? How good are you at critical thinking?
That Farm Bill?
Yeah.
Very important point that I think I'm glad you brought up, because what I'm always hearing is 25% of kids in America face food insecurity, but the Farm Bill makes it harder to feed people by adding regulations. I mean, I get it. Okay, so I don't want to say I don't want food regulated. I mean, I kind of don't, but at the same time, I understand why it's there, because I want to make sure the food I'm consuming is not going to kill me. So that's why the regulations are supposed to be there.
Right.
But, I have a vertical tower garden in my home, and it's growing some bok choy, personal things. And then I'm hearing murmurs in the political space that growing food at home is actually bad for the environment. And I'm like, come on, I'm trying to feed my own self, Like, this is the rhetoric that's going to be used in 5, 10, 15 years, the climate change. Not saying that there's not climate change. What I'm saying is that scare tactic will be used to conglomeratize even further the food supply, which is not good. I mean, we want a free market, a free capitalist system to allow farmers to be able to freely produce the food that they're the experts at. You mentioned that the legislators are not the experts. The farmers are the experts.
Right.
So let them grow the food in the way that they know best and serve their community. So that, in a way, is like decentralizing the food supply. It's allowing the market to fulfill the market demands, which is the 25% of kids facing food insecurity. It makes the cost cheaper. So I wonder, why don't more people talk about it?
Why don't more people? You mean just the average person?
Well, more farmers, well, maybe they are talking about it. I don't know.
Well, the
What
farmers
are
certainly are, but
Thomas Massey's talking about it?
yes, I love that Thomas Massey talks about it.
Hmm.
I greatly appreciate his perspective on the environment and
Hmm.
his ability to sort of be off the grid and
Hmm.
even some of the crazy things he's created to do so.
Hmm.
I think a lot of people are so disconnected from nature
Yeah.
that it's become something that they don't think too much about. Right. I think the average person doesn't think too much about where their food comes from or where their garbage is going.
Hmm.
Two major issues as far as environment is concerned. Instead,
That's
they're
right.
worried about carbon. And why are they worried about carbon? Because the media has told us to worry about carbon. So I do think we need to get our kids back in touch with nature. And that's one of the things that the federal government absolutely can contribute to, because we're sending billions of dollars per year, 17 billion on school lunches, right?
Hmm.
And we're giving them pizza in a plastic bag. So, and we're telling them that that's their vegetable, right? Their ketchup is their vegetable. So I was aware of this Two Hands Foods that was working with a gem academy in Chicago. You had a couple of chefs that were sourcing local food from farms, and then they were working it into the curriculum. So when they do empanadas or something, they would actually teach them about the
Nice.
cultural connection, right? So you can incorporate that as science because they were learning to cook, agriculture, and history, culture in general. There's just so many things that you can do to reconnect the kids with nature. And if you did that, I think there would be a lot more conversations at home about where our food comes from.
Absolutely. And it's interesting. I have a random question. I'm sure you know Nicole Shanahan. Have you ever talked to her?
Yes. So I've been on Zoom calls with Nicole, but
Yeah.
we haven't had a private conversation. I would love to be on her podcast and
Yeah.
talk with her more specifically, but I'm hoping to be part of some of the solutions. I'm in the app that they're using to have
Hmm.
conversations about policy.
Yeah. The reason I'm asking is because, man, you remind me so much of her with the way that you speak. The topics is like there's so much alignment there. And to be honest, when I was backing Robert F. Kennedy Jr. big time personally, like I'm speaking on behalf of myself as a citizen, he talks about the things that I, as a parent, am concerned about for my kids. And he's the only one brave enough to talk about it.
Yep.
And that's, well, I don't know if it's brave enough, or maybe it is brave enough to go against the establishment. And he's definitely a populist. He's a left-leaning populist, and I'm generally on the right. In fact, I'm more on the right than I am anything else. But he spoke my language, and I was prepared to vote for him in the general election because he talked about those very important things. And I was honestly skeptical of Nicole at first because I saw her background, and then I heard her talk, and I was like, oh, she won me over. I was like, I really want to see her make more moves. I hope she has a place in the next administration. She hits the points. And so then I hear people like you who are also talking about these things. These are the things that I can't believe more people don't realize, and they should be outraged that pizza is considered a vegetable.
Right.
Why are people not outraged? This is ridiculous
Yeah.
that it's gotten through that way. So
I
I'm glad you talked about it.
Thank you. I actually sat on the wellness committee for our school district,
Hmm.
and it was run by the food service program, or by the person who was in charge of the food service was actually the chair of our committee.
Hmm.
And we had several heated conversations about why they could use their food credits to get a la carte items. So they could just come in and use their credits to get chocolate milk and cookies.
Mm.
And I said, we have kids that are nutritionally starving, and they're coming in and they're just getting sugar laden foods, which is not feeding their brain. It makes it harder for the teachers.
Hmm.
Certainly, encourages the ADHD and their inability to focus. And her response to me was, that's what sells. And immediately, and also the fact that they were a for profit. And immediately that told me that we're backwards, right? Because
Mm.
it shouldn't be about what sells. If kids are hungry, they're going to eat if you put nutritious food in front of them and you don't allow them to have ice cream or candy. As a parent, I had to make those decisions for my kids when they were little. I couldn't just give them ice cream for dinner. They had to eat nutritious food first. And so we need to definitely be looking at where our federal funds are going. And I think that's something the administration could do right out of the gate to completely change the requirements associated with those federal funds.
Yeah, excellent point. So it's interesting because you're talking about these same concerns that I have at home. And the reason that we moved our oldest son, he's 2 years old, and we moved him to a new daycare. Yesterday was his first day at his new daycare. And the reason that we even switched, like the old daycare was literally walking distance. Like I walk not even 60 seconds and I'm at the daycare. That's how close it is to my house. But we moved him to a daycare 30 minutes drive away because of some very key issues. One is the nutrition, because they don't allow us to send home food with him. So all he eats at school is like super processed foods and like those fruits that come in a sugar syrup and all that stuff. And we noticed that it's actually negatively impacting him. And so we're like, okay, we need to make a change. We're willing to make this sacrifice for our child. And it aggravates me so much when I see people online talking about how there's scientific proof that sugar doesn't cause hyperactivity in kids. And I'm like, watching it with my own two eyes, my son eats a candy and he's hyper for the next 4 hours. Like, you're trying to tell me that I don't see these patterns because your precious science tells you. And I'm not opposed to science. I love it. But this doesn't make sense. Like, who's backing these scientific studies? I think those are the questions we need to ask. You touched on something very briefly. Something sells. So if something sells, there's going to be a conglomerate environment to make sure that that is selling even more, right? And big sugar, big food, all that stuff. It's a crazy world out there.
It is a crazy world out there. And so much of the data that we receive is in support of products to buy, right? And people will sometimes, when I have these discussions, they'll say, well, see, that's why capitalism is bad. And I can see that sometimes we end up in corruption because of that. But really where it takes over is when you have the incentives tied in from the government, right? Where it perversely manipulates the market. Because if we truly had free market capitalism and people had good information and they knew, like, they weren't getting science to say those things were good, if they actually got the science that said, no, that does cause hyperactivity, if people had true, accurate information, I do think that we would have more people that would support the right direction, right? In the free market capitalism model. And so we just need to get back to that, because we definitely have industry paying for most of the studies. And so those studies are always going to lean more towards the selling of those particular products.
There's a very wonderful comic that I saw the other day. Let me see if I can find it real quick. But it's right on this topic, because it talks about right here. I don't know if it shows us forward or backwards for you. Says an important scientific study. I can't read it from that far away, but it's basically saying an important scientific study that proves that the result of a scientific study depends entirely on where its funding comes from.
That's true.
So it just speaks to me, because there are certain things, like, people are rightly concerned with corporate capture. But that's not capitalism. That's corporatism, or like some kind of corporate legislative oligarchy. That's not really capitalism. That's not the market playing itself out. That's people with big money entering into the government and making regulations and laws that are favorable to them and not the others. So that would be I often do say that's not capitalism. It's a perverse alternative to capitalism. But yeah, well, I want to go back to this election, right? Because it's you as an independent. There's Mr. John Booras as the Republican, and there's the incumbent Congresswoman Delia Ramirez, who is in her first term. So what is the dynamic of this election? Because you've spoken to so many people in your district, and even outside of your district who would support you. And then there are, I'm not sure. Well, what is your thoughts? What's the dynamic of this election? Is it going to flip? Is it going to, are people dissatisfied with the incumbent, or what's the dynamics going on here?
Yeah, so when they gerrymandered this district 2 years ago, they completely changed the shape of the district, and they pulled in more people from Cook County so that they could ensure that it was a much higher swing between Democrat and Republican. So it's like a 70-30 split. And it really meant that they don't have to do much campaigning because it's such a huge swing. And when I jumped in, I do have a reputation for getting along with both Democrats and Republicans and truly being an independent. So it's not like I'm branded one or the other and I'm a convert. And I do know that amongst many Democrats that were aware that I was running, that's problematic for them. Because then I could pull Democrat votes. And if I pull Democrat votes, that does become a problem for them. So I think that was a big part of the reason that there was a concerted effort to make sure that I did not get on the ballot. And overall, when you're in this district, I think even with the dissatisfaction of the immigrant crisis and even with the dissatisfaction of the economy, I still don't know that I still don't think that there are enough Democrats that would switch over and vote for John Booras. So that was really part of the reason that I ran, because I saw that ability to be able to kind of draw and bring unity and bring people more center on the issues. But given that I'm a write-in, I mean, it's really difficult to get people to know what to do with a write-in. You have to remember the person's name. I will say this, though. The cards we gave out, I know a lot of people put them in their wallet and they kept them, because when I'd run into them again and again, there were people I ran into 5 or 6 times and they would pull the card out of their wallet and say, I already signed. So that was great. But I'm not sure that people will really remember. If I'm not on there, they might think, oh, maybe she's not in my district.
Right.
Because I tried to get some mainstream news and I've had some interviews. They won't air them. So I had ABC National interview me, didn't get aired. But of course, they asked me about January 6th and about the election being stolen. And I think my answer might be a little too cogent, which is, I don't pretend to opine over what the results might have been. But what I do know is that even in our own county, I witnessed that they weren't checking signatures on all the dropped off ballots. So because I witnessed that with my own eyes, and we actually did sue them and they did lose in court that they were wrong, we have a problem. And I can't say to what extent that problem is, but it's enough of a problem that we need to address it. And we shouldn't be gaslighting people by telling them there's no problem when they see it with their own eyes, right? And
I'm sure they didn't like that.
They do not like that answer. Why? Because that answer makes a lot of sense, right? And it resonates with people across the board. Same thing with January 6th being, I know a lot of people that went because they were dissatisfied with what was going on. They had no intentions of creating any riot or violence or anything. These are peaceful people. And I had people that had FBI show up at their house because they used their credit card in DC. So to say that the government wasn't weaponized against us by the Democratic Party is foolhardy. You're listening to propaganda if you believe that didn't happen. So we need to stop gaslighting people. We need to look at things for what they really are and not, buy into these narratives. And they really don't like when I say that. I had an interview with the Tribune. Again, they also didn't print any of the stuff. I gave them all the insight into what happened with Kennedy and Ballot Access, because I was very much a part of that. And then also what happened with my campaign. And they didn't print any of it. I thought the interviewer was actually very interested in what I had to say, so I was hopeful, but I think it got nixed farther up the food chain there. And they did just recently run an article, actually a 4-page spread on ballot access in Illinois, but they only talked about what happened in the primary. They just released it, but they talked about what happened months and months ago that you can do nothing about. They didn't bring light or want to mention a candidate's name. So I know that that's a strategy, is to just keep you out of the media if they're worried about you getting traction. And for that, I think that's really been probably my biggest hurdle.
Yeah, it sucks to. I empathize with you in the sense that I've experienced my own issues with being silenced, with being censored, and things like that. Because I'm not a candidate, but you don't have to worry about me not airing this because it'll be recorded and it'll be published. Because we believe in the democratic process so much, and despite the challenges we faced, our YouTube channel got banned for quote unquote misinformation in August. Yeah. And then my personal Facebook got banned last week. And our company Instagram that we've had for 12 years got banned. So this was also last week simultaneously. And so I know that the political establishment does not like what I'm doing, but that makes me fired up to do this even more, because people like yourself need to have this information get out there, because people need to know this stuff. People need to know that one of the guys we had on our podcast was running in for a seat on the public hospital, general hospital. And he was calling out that what happened during COVID at that hospital was some type of orders being given from outside of the hospitals that were resulting in people actually dying. And I'm pretty sure that interview was what resulted in our podcast being banned on YouTube. And so it's like, I empathize, but people need to know this stuff. People need to be aware. And of course, people aren't going to be, I don't fault them for this. It's the establishment's fault, but they're not going to know that you're a write-in candidate unless that information is out there. And that was clearly meant to bully you off, because they know that the powers that be, and I looked at the redistricting, I don't think any part of the district is even part of the new district. The old district is completely separate geographically from the new district. There's no overlap from the map that I saw. So it's like, there's so many different sequence of things that you're going through to challenge you on this, but I respect you for still being here anyway and going forward with this.
Thank you. Yeah. And there are a lot of people that have said, oh yeah, I wouldn't have been able to make it that far. I would have bagged, but I felt called to do this, and it was really to bring the message forward. Again, that we need to stop being propagandized. We need to come back together as Americans. And I think you mentioned we really do have a lot more in common than, what people think we do.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're coming to the close of this, but what I'm going to do here is I'll let you know we're going to edit this and then publish it to Twitter. So it's going to be on our PolicalLens Twitter channel. We'll send you the link. I believe you have it, right? If you do.
I think so.
Yeah. We'll tag you on that. We'll find you, tag you, and you can actually download the interview.
Okay.
And as a big way of saying like a middle finger to the establishment, what we did is we're allowing our candidates to download every single one of our videos and upload it to their own YouTube channels. So it's going to be, this information is going to be out there anyway. So if you have a YouTube, feel free to upload it to your YouTube channel, Facebook, all that good stuff. You're welcome to use these videos to help get the message out further. So I hope you do take advantage of that.
Thank you.
And yeah, if you decide to run again, I would love to have you on again.
I'd love to talk to you again. I appreciated our conversation. I appreciate what you're doing, and keep at it.
Yeah, we shall. So yeah, it's good to talk to you, and hopefully we'll see you on the next one. And for the voters, hope you guys got good value out of this. Make sure to share it with other people in the Illinois 3rd Congressional District to make sure everybody has a chance to hear who she is. Miss Angel Oakley is on the ballot as a write-in candidate. So thank you guys for watching. And Miss Oakley, it was awesome having you. Thank you.
Thank you.
You have a good day.
You too.